This lecture is looking at models of participation. It examines ways in which citizens are enabled to participate, to be involved, to partake in making decisions about their own communities. In the lecture, we look at three interrelated and mutually reinforcing concepts. These are governance. We then look at citizen participation, and we look at specific modes or ways in which citizens engage, in which they participate in local decision making. So we begin with governance. Here on the screen in front of you, you see a fresco painted by Lorenzetti, as indicated there on the left-hand side. And the title of this fresco, which is in the town hall in Siena in Italy, is called Good Government. It was painted during the Renaissance period, and for further information about it, you can use the link that's under the picture. This is a useful image because it provides us with an insight into what governance and good government are. Here we see a certain degree of hierarchy, we see a certain degree of order, but we also see dialogue, we see interaction, we see people engaging with one another, we see people conversing. To an extent, there is an element of participation. In the same building, on the opposite wall, there is another fresco, and it's called Bad Government. And one of the features here is that there are fewer people. We could say, in our modern parlance, there is less participation. There are fewer citizens. And those images we do see on the screen, most of them are faceless. There are no faces. The faces are deliberately obscured. So we see some of the contrasts between good government and bad government. Good government is more transparent, it's more inclusive, there is more participation. Another image here, and this is just to, again, provide some of the contrasts and to enable us to understand and to define the concept of governance. I'm sure you've experienced what's on the left-hand side there with the bad cop, bad governance, inefficiencies, red tape, lots of bureaucracy, poor administration, corruption, secrecy. Think of the Lorenzetti picture. On the right-hand side, you see the good cop. You see good governance, and some of the features of good governance are listed there. The rule of law, transparency, being open, participation, accountability, and sustainability. So we see participation is integral to, it is a feature of good governance. Now, I have a definition here of good governance. This comes from the United Nations, and it articulates principles of good governance. It says that good governance promotes equity, participation, which as again is our focus in this lecture, pluralism, which is a diversity, transparency, openness, accountability, the rule of law, in a manner that is effective, efficient, and enduring. So that's the theory, and we can see that participation is a core element thereof. Just to expand on the definitions a little bit more, we see here the interlocking features and elements of good governance: efficiency and effectiveness. On top, we see at the bottom then, on the left-hand side, equity and inclusion. We also see transparency. And just above those, we see two features. One, on the left, participatory and responsible. So people participate They have rights to participate, but with those rights come responsibilities. So there is an element of decision making. And then we have on the right hand side, related to that, generator of consensus. So in good governance, decisions are generally by consensus. People strive for consensus. Each of the actors, each of those who's participating, brings something to the process, and the actors then work collectively to promote consensus, to take decisions by consensus. Those are two elements of good governance. So participation, leading to collaborative or joint decision making with an emphasis on consensus. Now, I have here some propositions to do with governance. So governance includes, and that's typo on the first line, includes government and non-governmental actors. So it's not about throwing out government. The top-down is still an element in governance, but it also is expanded to be more inclusive, to enable more participation by non-governmental actors, because those have skills, those have very valuable things to contribute to the development process. We know that in good governance, boundaries are blurred and responsibilities are shared in tackling issues. That relates to the consensual decision making. So it's not so boundaries are blurred, and that's a good thing. It can be challenging. It means that organizations move away from their silos and they begin to work with other actors. Power is shared, actors depend on one another, and actions are collective. The government provides guidance, it provides a steer, it often provides the funding and the resources to enable projects, to enable activities to happen, but decisions are collective, and there's an element of networking. And networking happens between the various actors and local autonomy. The principle of subsidiarity comes into play here. Subsidiarity, that decision making happens as close as possible to the level of the citizen. So as you can see, there's a political element in governance, and political implies participation. It also involves culture. What is the culture of your organization? What is the culture of the organizations with which you interface? Are they open to governance? Are they open to participation, to the principles that we have outlined already? When you look at the literature about governance, you will probably come across work by Stoker, among others, and often you will find references to this transition from government to governance. I would caution, this is not a linear transition. It's not replacing government. Government is an actor, remains an actor, but government is obliged, is challenged, is required to do things differently, particularly to take decisions differently, to take decisions in a way that includes citizens, in a way in which citizens participate in the decision making. And presently, I will talk about co-decision making. And here in the literature, you will see elements and features of governance, that it is collaborative, generally collaboration in your context between bottom-up and top-down actors, that there is a need for flexibility. And that's a challenge for many in government, that there's an openness to new actors, an openness to new ideas, that there's an element of innovation, and with innovation comes a certain degree of risk-taking. Governance is of the people, and it is intentional. And with governance, you usually find plans, multi-annual strategic plans, and those plans are reviewed, and then actors take on board the recommendations, the outcomes of reviews, and work collectively and collaboratively to promote and to drive development. So here in this little model, you see on top, maybe the old approach, the to and the for. So people experiencing things being done to them, being told what to do. And that still happens. Talk to members of certain minorities, particularly maybe the Roma, Gypsy, traveller community. They feel that things are done to them. Others make decisions about them, about their ways of life, and about the services and so on that should or shouldn't be provided for them. So things done to them in the top-down manner. And then we have things being done for people. And you're aware in communities sometimes there can be a dependency culture, dependence on the state, dependence maybe on the mayor, maybe dependence on a powerful leader or whomever. So things being done for citizens. And I would say that in the post-COVID transition, it's difficult for communities now to move away from things being done for them because during those 2 years, decisions were made by professionals for people, and there was a generally a degree of compliance with those. So the traditional approach, the to and the for, whereas down below then we have the movement away from the expert to the gapper to working alongside. We see the role of animation, things being done with people, nothing for us without us. And that's really important in terms of promoting equity and equality, and when we talk about gender equality in particular. And then we have on the right hand side, done by us, for us. So where you have self-help, self-actualization, communities doing things by themselves, for themselves, and then on the left-hand side, with the local citizen and with the various cohorts, the various stakeholders then in that community. So that's possibly a useful model to sum up the transition. And then in terms of participation, we have to acknowledge that it doesn't happen by accident. We need to invest. We need to invest in empowerment, in empowering communities, in promoting cooperation. So you can see there on the left-hand side what communities do best, what services do they do best, and how can they work together. Those are some of the questions that maybe you'd like to reflect on with your community. And then again, there's another question, and again, it's a reflexive question for ourselves. What happens when communities drive their own project? And yes, sometimes communities make mistakes, but we learn from mistakes. Sometimes the state makes mistakes as well, but with the communities in the driving seat, as the image suggests, there is more scope for participation. There's more scope for innovation. There's more scope for creativity. But of course, like I was saying earlier, there's also the responsibilities that come with the roles of driving a particular project. Another feature of governance is that we have a lot of linkages and interfaces. So on the left-hand side there, you see the various geographies from the local level to the state level or the provincial or the regional level, then to the national level, European Union, and then on a more international scale. And the arrows that are going up and down, those represent the vertical linkages. So with governance, communities that are down there at the local level will find themselves interacting with national government. They relate to the European Union. We've already in this module spoken about LEADER, and that comes predominantly from the European Union. We've referred already in this module to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Those are at a global level, but they reach into communities, they speak to community agendas, so you have that level of interfacing. And then we have those UN SDGs influencing and interfacing with national with EU policies influencing national policies, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of linkages on that uh, um, vertical, those vertical axes that are there. But then you also see in the model arrows going horizontally, and those are the linkages and the interfaces between actors at the local and the other levels. At the local level, we talk about good governance involving cooperation between communities, avoidance of competition for scarce resources. So communities pooling their resources, pooling their expertise, overcoming the competitive nature that may have characterized relations between communities. We see the same then at, say, at the provincial level, where local authorities coalesce, they work together. In France, you have the Contrat de Pays. In Spain, you have mancomunidades, you have comarcas in Catalonia, and so on, where local authorities work together, particularly in areas like spatial planning, because they recognize that communities, they recognize that modern economies, social networks, and so on cross local authority boundaries. So intermunicipal approaches are appropriate to the promotion of development. And that involves sharing authority, sharing decision making. It involves collaboration and the features that we have mentioned earlier on. So governance, it's a messy business. It's more complicated than traditional government. So it involves action and actors at multiple layers and levels, and there's a lot of linkage and interfacing happening that was not happening in the past. So I've tried to summarize all of that in one slide and to say that there are merits associated with governance, associated with participation. So if and on the left hand side, the merits, the positives are listed, the drivers, the reasons why, the merits. So there's greater buy-in and support. If people are involved, if they participate in making a particular decision about development, they're far more likely then to buy in, to support that development trajectory. New ideas and creativity are associated with participation. The more people who participate, the broader the skills pool, and the greater the knowledge capital that can be brought to bear on a development plan, a trajectory, a project, or whatever. There is more innovation, and that again is associated with creativity and a degree of risk taking. If people participate, they're informed, but access to information is, at the same token, a gateway to enable participation to happen. It is almost a criteria for, therefore. And then there's more understanding of the roles, the responsibilities, the points of view, the skills, etc., of the different actors. Because if they're working together, they generate then understandings of different perspectives and a common understanding. There's greater efficiency because people are bought in to the process from the outset if they were involved. Then in the creation and decision making, they're more likely to be involved in delivery. Planning tends to be more strategic, and you have a pool of expertise and an enhanced web of knowledge capital from which to draw. So there's a lot of reasons as to why we should promote and encourage and advocate participation and good governance. But there are challenges. All of this requires time, talking to everybody, getting them on board, convincing in some cases, cajoling in other cases, changing cultures in some cases, building trust. Organizations that may never have worked together before need to get to know each other. They need to trust one another. And some organizations in some sectors, could be health, it could be education, it could be transport, tend to be territorial. They tend to be working in silos, and we require them to overcome that and sometimes to share resources, to share data, to share budgets, and that can be challenging. This is relatively new, and because it's new, it requires a degree of flexibility, but sometimes we have to ask ourselves, is there too much flexibility? You know, is governance too elastic a concept? If you have too many people participating, to borrow the phrase, will too many cooks spoil the broth? So that's a question, that's a challenge. And then sometimes there are gaps in perception and capacity. Have we the right stakeholders on board? We have to ask ourselves. Um, you know, do we build the capacity to enable collaborative decision making? And then how do we involve the citizens, account to citizens, and yet at the same time report to funders? And what is the role of the funder in the decision making? So, yes, there are a lot of merits, but there are challenges. It's not easy. It can be messy. It's fluid. It's evolving. It changes. But we need to be open to those changes, and we need to evaluate on an ongoing basis. We need process indicators in evaluation. Another term that you will see associated with good governance and participation is that of co-design. So I just want to say a little bit about that and how it in dovetails with what I've been saying. This also refers to participation. It's about a participatory approach to designing solutions in which community members are treated as equal collaborators in the design process. So if they're treated as equal collaborators, that implies that the community is involved in making the decisions, in scoping out the roadmap, in deciding what the trajectory of decision making of the project, of the initiative will be, rather than just being consulted about it and expected to react or to respond. So co-design is quite ambitious, but it involves equal participation, collaboration in all stages, including, as it says there, in the design. So co-design, it's a well-established approach to creative practice, particularly in elements of the public sector. And you see there references to participatory design techniques that emerged in Scandinavia about 50 years ago. It's an umbrella term for participatory co-creation. So you can see the link between that and participation, which is the focus of our module, of our lecture. And then, as I was saying, it goes beyond consultation. So it's on a higher level, it's much deeper, it's more profound, it's more extensive, by building and deepening equal collaboration by the citizens who are affected by or attempting to resolve a particular challenge, come up with solutions, or in the case of resilient communities, to enable them to realize their potential. And the idea is that the users are experts of their experience and they become central to the design. It can be challenging, but it's really worthwhile. And I've seen co-design happening in some very creative contexts, seen it worked, working with children, with older people, particularly in places like, urban design and village design statements and so on. Really valuable. And all of this, of course, ties back into participation. Now, there are just some techniques there around co-design that some of you may have heard, like Lego Serious Play, storytelling or story mapping, and so on and so forth. I've just simply put them on the slide there. There is a link there at the bottom if you want to explore these techniques a little bit further, depending on what practice you are involved in. So, as we conclude that journey into governance, I'd just like you to reflect for a moment about the governance in your own community. How would you describe governance arrangements in your community. Describe vertical and horizontal features of governance in the community. So just describe it. That's all we're asking you to do. I'm not asking you to necessarily critique it or analyze it. Just describe. What does it look like? Who are the actors? Who's participating? Who's not participating? How do decisions happen? Is there shared power? Is government involved? And if government is involved, what layers or tiers of government? And as we've said before, communities can be geographical communities, but they don't have to be. They could be thematic, they could be issue-based, and increasingly indeed, we have virtual communities as well. So just think of the governance landscape, the governance arrangements in a community with which you are familiar. So that's governance. So there's a lot going on there. It's a heavy topic. I accept that. So I hope that those slides there have elucidated things for you. Now, that's we saw governance and that participation is an element of governance. So I just want to zero in now more specifically in terms of what is participation. And this is one of my favorite images in community development. This is Arnstein's ladder of participation. Now, she had another version of it as well with several rungs, but if this is all we really need. These 4 rungs or tiers or steps on the ladder. The bottom step is where people, citizens, communities are just given information about a development. Yes, that's good. It's right. It's important to inform people about it. The next step is consultation, whereby citizens, communities, actors are consulted and the decision makers take on board the feedback from those consultations and bring those feedbacks and suggestions and recommendations from the community to bear on their decision. And yes, they may, but they may not, change, tweak, modify, review their decisions. That's better than just giving people information in participation terms. The next step on the ladder is representation. And this means that the community, the citizens, those who are affected by decisions, as co-design would suggest, are represented in decision making. So they have access to information, they're consulted, and they're represented in the decision making process. But are they equally represented? Maybe, maybe not. But with the highest rung of the ladder, they participate. They are full and equal actors in the information, consultation, design, delivery, everything to do with the process, so that you have good governance associated then with community participation. That is the highest rung, the highest tier, the highest level in the ladder. Again, in terms of the reflections, what are your experiences of the vertical interfaces, the vertical linkages? Do you just get information, or have you had experiences of the higher rungs of the ladder? If you hear from an agency, from government, either local or regional, wherever, where have you put and where have you enabled communities to be? Now, there's a lot of text on this slide, but just to explain to you, these sentences are about describing what is good participation. You can read them in your own time, but I want to point out a word that keeps coming up in these, and it is process. It's there in number 3, 4, 5, 6. It's a process, so it is ongoing. I think you probably got that message from me earlier on in terms of governance, because that's something that needs to be ongoing. It's a process. It's it's not an end in itself. It's a process. So we keep going back to investing in, supporting, nurturing, promoting participation. It's not something you do once at the start of an initiative or a development trajectory or whatever. It's something that you embed, that you continually work at. And then you see there the second last point, the power sharing, the negotiations between the different interests based on equality. And then you have organization, back to that Lorenzetti piece as well that we had at the beginning. So participation is a process. The next slide is the reverse, the opposite. So participation is not, because sometimes we hear people talking the language of participation, but it's not really espousing or giving effect to the principles that I had on the previous slide. It's not showing the principles of good governance. It's not going up the tiers or the rungs of Einstein's ladder of participation. And you have there some of the bad or sharp practices that we find in development that are couched or cloaked in the language of participation, but they're not good enough. It's not just enough, not good enough to just give people information or assume that you understand what's better for them, or involving people at one stage and excluding them in the other, and so on. It needs to be much more holistic. And the last point there is challenging for some communities, because sometimes certain people are consulted with and others are not. That's not participation. It needs to be targeted, it needs to be inclusive, it needs to reflect the principles of good governance. So we have what a definition there. Einstein's ladder is a really useful definition of participation, and then you've seen the principles, the do's, and the don'ts in terms of participation. Why are we talking about participation? Participation is good for community development, as we have seen, but it's also good for our democracies. People who participate in civic life are also more likely to vote. They're more likely to stand for office. And this is good for our democracies, as well as being good for the promotion of resilience in our communities. So there's a wider social science and political science literature, a lot of evidence to show this as well. And that's what I just want to mention that, and that's why we have the yin and yang there, that complementarity between representation and participation. I just want to say a little bit more about that. I have an image here from rural Switzerland, and this is participative democracy in action. This is where the citizens of the town meet in the town square, and you have a collective approach to decision making. You can see this is a rural community. You can see the mountains in the background, quite small, but very high level of participation. There's a lot of people there for a small rural settlement. And then in the middle of the square, you have the mayor, you have the councillors, they're listening, they're managing, steering, guiding the process, but there's co-decision making with the citizens. And you can see they're holding various color cards, raising them up or taking them down as they vote on particular decisions that affect their community. Now, Switzerland, it has a very distinctive system of democracy. They also call it direct democracy in Switzerland, but it's based on participation, and it happens, at all tiers, from the national, the federal, the canton level, and then, as we're seeing here, in communities as well. All of this takes time. Now, the United Nations estimates that the process to which I referred earlier, it takes about 15 years. Sorry, you didn't want to hear that maybe. But if you look across the x-axis there, we have time, and then you have the levels of development on the y-axis. And levels of development are associated, of course, with, among other things, with resilience. So we have to go through the various steps. And the first step there is acquiring the know-how. So you participate, you acquire the know-how of development, you make mistakes, you innovate, you try, you get build up relationships, you start putting that know-how then into practice. And then from your learning, from evaluations, from continually reviewing the process, only then can you move on then to self-sustained levels of development. It takes time and you need to keep reinventing the process. And that slide I think is useful if you're ever asked for a definition of what is community development. And of course, participation is integral to all of those steps on that community development journey. And then going back to what we talked about at the very start of the module, particularly with Alistair's lecture there on governance, on leader, we talked about partnership governance. And here we're looking at the different actors who can participate in partnership. So here I'm looking at three parties in a broad sense. So on the right hand side in blue, you have the state, the official, the political, the administrative. That can be local government, it can be regional government, it can be agencies of the state, maybe the Forest Service, the tourism um, uh, institutions, fisheries, the people who look after the marine, and so on. And then down at the bottom in the grey, in this model, they've called it the private sector. But in France and in Ireland, we refer to the social partners, or it's often referred to as the productive sector, the farmers, the employers' bodies, the trade unions, the people who represent the workers, the banks. In many rural communities, we're talking about the cooperative banks. So it's the economy. So the state, the economy. And then you can see there are lots of actors within that. And then on the left-hand side in the green, you have community or civil society. And like I said earlier, civil society is diverse in terms of geography, in terms of interest, in terms of themes and so on that communities look at. And there's overlap between the different types and sectors and themes and interests in communities. So there's quite a bit of diversity and indeed a growing diversity in communities. And partnership structures and leader local action groups among them need to be open to new actors coming in from, particularly from civil society, because that's where a lot of the creativity and the innovation happens, and indeed from the other sectors as well. So that's the tripartite model of governance based on partnership and in which participation needs to be implicit. I've just spelt it out a little bit more here in this model here, where we have the public sector on top, you have your local government, and then you have the various, town councils, regional authorities, etc. Then we have our social partners, the productive sector there on the red, and then I just have some suggested um, actors, bodies, organizations from community and voluntary, from civil society. And you see there the environmental groups, culture, youth organizations, and so on. So all together, put them together in that wheel. It's interesting, the two models, both are wheels, they're circular, driving forward, driving a development onward. So just some of the models there that you can look at. So driving development, we want more people to participate. We know it's messy, we know it's challenging, we know it takes time. But we're looking here at the merits, the values of pooling resources, putting everything together, drawing on the strengths of all of the actors. So we can see what each of them brings to the table, what each of them brings to the development process. Community and voluntary sector has a particular awareness. They know about local aspects. For example, there, in terms of awareness on social and cultural aspects, they have a particular awareness. The social partners have a different awareness. They know about the economic aspects. The public sector knows about the political, the institutional, administrative aspects. And then putting all of those together realizes a new corpus of knowledge to be created, drawing on the strengths, the insights, the knowledge, the know-how of all three strands. And then that gives you an improved reading of the improved understanding of the area. It highlights new opportunities. That's just in terms of awareness alone. As you yourselves read from left to right across the table here, you can see that yes, the community, statutory, social partners have different viewpoints, but rather than being conflictual about those viewpoints or about their interests, they pool the positives from them together that allow then, as it shows at the bottom across the table, the last two rows show the added value that can be realized when each of the actors comes together. There is that participation and they're pooling, sharing their resources via the partnership governance model. And that gives you added value. And of course, that contributes to resilience among other outcomes. I think it's interesting, given what we're talking about, resilience, participation, that the European Rural Parliament, which has delegates from all of the member states, um, talks about partnership between governments and local stakeholders. And you can read the text there. They believe that effective rural development demands an open minded and innovative partnership, which we've just been talking about, between governments and stakeholders at all levels of decision making process, including civil society, local businesses, local institutions, local governments, and people as equals. Equals, equals, equality, and that's participation. And they call upon rural stakeholders to work positively with governments, and they call upon governments, international institutions, and appropriate agencies to establish systems of consultation, that's on Einstein's ladder of participation, collaborative decision making, that's moving to the next tier of the ladder, and then adequate resources in order to shape and implement the policies and to lay a strong foundation for fruitful partnership between rural stakeholders and governments at all levels. So that's a manifesto agreed by the delegates of the European Rural Parliament, and they see this process as integral to sustainable development and the promotion of resilience right across rural Europe. So process is integral to the future and to good practice as far as they're concerned. So now we've talked about governance, we've talked about participation. You can see how they're interwoven. So next set of reflections, participation in your community. Who participates in community development? I think you've guessed the next question. You know, is our community relying on the few? Who does not participate? These are challenging questions for any community, but they're worth teasing out, worth thinking about. The people who do not participate, are they excluded or have they chosen not to participate? What are the barriers to participation? And these are the things now we need to look at in our tutorial. And the last bit I want to do briefly is to look at modes of engagement. And the tutorial is really where we want to do this because I can just give you some examples, but you have loads of examples, each and every one of you. And we want to hear your examples rather than you hearing my examples. But just to conclude, modes of engagement, in other words, ways in which people are enabled to participate and to get up those rungs of Einstein's ladder. Probably all heard of smart villages. And yes, ICT, information communications technology, can enable people to participate. The housebound, it can enable people who are in isolated rural areas to participate more in local decision making, for example. So technology can be enabling in that respect. But my understanding and my experience of smart villages is that yes, ICT is a feature, but the community development principles, the participatory principles that are in the ENRD, the European Network for Rural Development, literature and guidelines and guidebooks and so on about smart villages, uh, the participation messages are core. It's really very much, as I see it, about traditional, I was going to say old fashioned, but I have said it now, so I'll say it, community development. The ICT, yes, is there, but the community development principles and the principle that the community is driving the bus with that collective participation, that's much more to the fore and much less negotiable in smart villages than is the ICT. The ICT is just an exponent or a manifestation of innovation, and the innovation happens because of participation. Simple good practice models, notice boards in villages. Not everybody is in the social media world. Um, on the right hand side, there is a toolkit around village design. I just put that up there because you see how co-design can happen in practice. And then some of you may be aware of eco villages. And I think eco villages are not just about ecological or environmental sustainability, they tend to be very good on sociocultural sustainability as well. And you tend to have co decision making, residents participating in making decisions, and very active in co design about and around and for their villages. So there's some very good examples of eco villages where you have high levels of engagement, good models of engagement, and participation. And some of you who are on the course have experience of participatory planning. And there's an example there from County Kerry in the southwest of Ireland. On the left hand side, one community that went to great efforts and has won awards for the extent to which they involved local citizens in devising a plan for their community. Yes, it's an infrastructural, environmental, facilities, amenities, it's a very um, multifaceted plan, but the strength of that plan is the extent to which people participated in the design process. There was, a very inclusive process underpinning it. The same with the one there on the right hand side, even though that's a few years earlier. And again, if you Google those, the one on the left hand side in particular, SD, has recorded and documented the participatory planning process, which makes it a good model that we can emulate. Then both of those, and indeed many other communities, right throughout rural Europe, and indeed we have it in other parts of the world as well. In Canada in particular, we have what's called geodesign, but it doesn't have to be geodesign. There are other ways in which you can use mapping, cartography, images, art, etc., to enable people to have a say, to participate, to envision how they want their place, their community, or their locality to be. Then there is the reaching out to the hard to reach groups. I made mention earlier on in this lecture about Roma. We talked about gender. There's poverty proofing. But one cohort that can be overlooked in co-design and co-decision are children. And we just have here some examples of children's art where children drew how they see their community now, how they'd like to see it in the future. And of course, then these drawings can be systematically coded or simply displayed, discussed, and can have discussions with children. You'll all find your own ways, but it's really important to involve the next generation. These are a very important cohort of stakeholders. We also have newcomers, migrants, others, but I think I've wanted to highlight children specifically in this lecture because I don't see them highlighted sufficiently in the rural development literature. Surveys, one of the classical ways of engaging people, promoting participation, but it's only on the bottom rung of the ladder. It's it's giving information, collating information, it's consulting to a certain extent, but it's important to take those steps. And if your community is multilingual, as we have here in this case in Ireland, that you make the publicity material, questionnaires as well then for feedback need to be available in the different languages. Important. Some of you, particularly those in Alpine Europe, Central Europe, probably have experience of design thinking, where communities work together to identify innovative solutions to common problems. So they work together, they define, they empathize, they define what their problem is, they articulate it, they generate ideas. As ideate, they're in the middle of the model. Then they come up with some solutions as it is the prototype, and they test that. Closer to home for us, there is an, an example of design thinking in the Innovative Communities project in Ireland's border region, and and just I'm sure there are others. Steyr in Austria is another very good example. Indeed, Steyr is the place from which innovating communities in Ireland emerged, but I just happen to have access there to the innovating communities showcase. And again, there were some really nice vignettes and case studies. Again, adding to the case studies that Sarah looked at 2 weeks ago in terms of resilience, but here using design thinking methodologies. Later on, Arena is going to be talking to you about placemaking. And I just wanted to flag for you the linkages between what we've been talking about in this week's lecture about participation, good governance, and placemaking. And here we just have some of the principles of place-based approaches. And the one want to highlight there is the one at the 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock position, which is being citizen-led. That image, don't forget, of the community driving the bus. So you will see a linkage between what we're talking about this week and indeed what we're talking about other weeks as well. Not just the case studies, but as I want to flag for you, that placemaking, which is going to be coming up. Now, in terms of readings, um, the one on the left-hand side is actually a 20-year-old document. It comes from the UK, but it is informed by a very extensive consultation process with communities. So there was participation in the writing up and the formulation of that charter. And there's some really, really good principles. It's quite radical in many respects because it says that, as well as participating in decision making, communities need to own the assets in their communities, including land, housing, infrastructure, and so on. Um, so it's interesting that it takes participation to that level, and that participation is really only meaningful when there's shared access to resources. And then so there's a lot in it. So for particularly I'm conscious of language issues here, but I think it's an interesting take on participation. So if you just look at the pages 11 to 23, that's fine. And then after that you can look specifically at each of the themes, and those themes then correspond to the petals that are of the flower there. But it's amazing to think that this is 20 years old, but as you read it you will realize that the issues really still resonate 20 years on. And then over on the right hand side, you see lovely colours there. There's a guide that has been produced in Ireland by a number of stakeholders, and all of their logos are on the bottom there. Um, it's just a guide for inclusive community engagement in local planning and decision making. So it's a kind of a how to promote participation. I think it's very useful, particularly from practitioners' perspective. and I've no hesitation in recommending it in that regard, because it does highlight as well how to promote participation among so-called hard-to-reach communities. So that concludes our talk on participation. And just then in terms of your assignment, we've looked a little bit at this already in terms of the reflections, and the guides and the readings will help you a little bit on this as well. So I want to know, how do people in your community participate in decision making? Remember earlier on we asked you to just describe governance, but now I want to know how they participate. Who participates and who does not participate? So now we're asking you to be a bit more analytical, maybe critical as well. And then why do some people participate less or more than others? So that's what we have for you by way of the assignment. Now, as I said, those are, quite profound as questions. They require a degree of reflection. So the tutorial next week now, or this coming week, should help you in that respect. Because in the tutorial, again, we're going to talk about participation. I'm going to ask maybe 3 or 4 students to tell us about a community in which there is good or high participation. So I'd like each of you to come to the tutorial with an example in your head or written down of positive, good participation, reflecting the principles that we have outlined in the lecture. So just tell us about it, where it is, and the types of participation that are happening. Then I'm going to get each of you to answer 3 questions then. Why do people participate in rural community development? So why? What motivates them? What enables them? What helps them? What maintains their participation? That positive question is really important, because if we can find out what's working well, we can build on it. Then I want to know, what are the barriers to participation? What stops or prevents people from participating in rural community development? And it's important then to end on a positive or a constructive note, and to ask, how can we lift, or how can we reduce, maybe eliminate, barriers to participation? So on Wednesday, everybody hopefully will have an example of good participation, and then I will ask each of you to contribute some insights and some knowledge into answering the 3 questions about why people participate, the barriers. Hopefully we won't spend too long on the barriers, so that we will have time then to look at how we lift, how we reduce, how we eliminate, hopefully, barriers as well. And then the last slide there then has just some additional references if you want to know more. But I've already shown you the guide book, really the one that came out in Ireland this week. And there's also the Carnegie chapter. So thank you very much for listening. And I wish you every success in promoting participation in your communities.